Got it. All right, welcome to tonight's Hampton Roads ISPI chapter meeting. There's 3 of us here in the room and several people online. We'll go around and do introductions here in the room, and then I'll call people online. Then we'll end with Raphael, and then he'll go into his presentation. That's kind of the gist of it. My name is Scott Weersing. I'm an instructional systems specialist for the Coast Guard. I work out of the training center Yorktown, where I'm currently consulting and helping people build training for search and rescue. Mark.
So are we on camera here?
No, you're gonna have to turn your microphone on and yours.
Oh, okay. I'm assuming that.
I'm not able to hear you now.
How about that? Oh, no.
Now I think you're muted.
Yeah, we can't do introductions in the room because we only have one microphone. But Bill's here.
Okay.
And Mark is here. We'll Christine, why don't you introduce yourself?
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So hi, my name is Christine. I teach in Suffolk. I teach Spanish for high schoolers and survival skills. No, just kidding. Just Spanish. It's the end of the year, so yeah. And yeah, I'm just interested in more than just Kahoot and things like that, and really would like to see what you have to offer. So thank you.
Awesome. And I would say that in some cases, Spanish is a survival skill. So there you go.
Vance, why don't you introduce yourself? Are you gonna introduce yourself, Vance, or not?
Still on mute.
Yep. If you want to introduce yourself, you have to come up here and talk into the microphone. We don't have microphones around the room. Up to Bill and Mark, and you guys, you want to come up here or not? You're not on camera because I don't have a camera.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, go ahead.
Vance Kinsey, I'm Master Black Belt, Lean Six Sigma Master Black Belt with Norfolk Naval Shipyard, an old CPT. Looking forward to his presentation. Thanks.
Awesome. Happy to have you here.
Yeah, we got Marcia's in the room, Bill, Mark, and myself. We only have one microphone and it's up here, so we're not really gonna do the rest of the introductions per se. And I'll hand it over to you, Raph.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with my presentation. Just let me know. Okay. Can everybody see the slide on the screen?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. So welcome everybody. Nice to meet everybody. This presentation was a really interesting endeavor, something that I really wanted to dive into for a long time, because I've been teaching game-based learning and gamification for a couple of years now, and I've done game-based learning and gamification in practice a few times, but I had never really explored the specifics of when do you do it, when do you not do it, and I started this investigation a few months ago, and that has blended into my course design as well. Obviously, we have that idea of there are specific purposes and there are specific costs related to these approaches, but really diving really deep into the subject, I thank you for the opportunity. So I am Rafael da Silva. I am a clinical assistant professor of organizational performance and workplace learning at Boise State University. Our program has different specialties, different expertises among our faculty members. We have folks that are focused on performance improvement, organizational culture, and then there's people like me who are focused more on development and design of training. I teach the classes that are focused on e-learning in our program, from the design, storyboarding aspects of design to full development within e-learning authoring tools. I designed and developed my game-based learning and gamification class as well. Have been through several iterations of that now, and always really interesting stuff comes out of that class. As I shared, this has been an area of research for myself as well over the past few years. And I also recently developed and delivered a course on artificial intelligence. So you might see some mentions of AI as it relates to game-based learning and gamification in this presentation. AI is everywhere, and I'm sure that people will be interested in how it relates to this specific topic, and I'll be happy to answer any specific questions that you might have about that after the presentation as well. My background, I got my master's and PhD in learning, design, and technology from the University of Georgia. My advisor was Dr. Lloyd Reber, who was doing game-based learning research in the late 1990s. So one of the pioneers in this field, to be honest. And I'm originally from Brazil. So if you notice some weird linguistic patterns during my presentation is because I'm not a native English speaker. So forgive me if something comes out kind of weird, but I'll do my best. This session is structured as follows. I will introduce the two concepts and provide examples: game-based learning and gamification. Sometimes in popular culture and common knowledge, we put those two together because they both relate to the concept of games, but in their essence and in theory, they are two different things, even though when they are implemented in practice, the lines can get a little bit blurry. We're going to define the two and see the strengths and weaknesses of both approaches, and talk about use cases as well. After this initial exposure, I will present some questions to consider. So based on the theory and the examples provided, what should you consider before implementing game-based learning or gamification in your organization? Finding alignment, finding if the approach is cost-effective, things like that. We will talk about development. So I'll present some case scenarios for specific types of content that you may develop aligned with game-based learning and gamification, and suggest some approaches. And finally, we'll talk about implementation. Implementation specifically is a very underrated aspect of game-based learning and gamification, because it's not just the creation of those platforms, the creation of those learning objects. Implementing is also a huge ordeal with great benefits if you really take advantage of what you are creating. So we're going to talk about that as well. So first of all, let's start with the basics. And the basic question is, what is a game? And this question is crucial to the entirety of this presentation, because This definition here by Salin and Zimmerman that I hold dear to my heart is something that you will see reflected in the recommendations. A game is a system in which players engage in an artificial conflict defined by rules that results in a quantifiable outcome. So let's unpack this definition. A system. So it's an environment with different variables. You do one thing here, something else is affected. Players engage. So there is somebody interacting with the system and doing things within this environment. There is some sort of conflict. There is a problem to be solved, either implicit or explicit through a specific narrative. There are specific rules. So games have specific ways that you can engage with them, and that is in terms of navigation, things you can do within those environments and things that you can't, and those are built into the design. And the result of that interaction is a quantifiable outcome. So the code calculates what you do in the system and considers what you did in the system in determining what the outcome of the game is going to be. Success usually means that you did everything correctly. If you think about a classic game like Super Mario, you reach the end of the level. You might have had some stumbles along the way, but the quantifiable outcome are the points that you get from that level, from that interaction, and the fact that you finish that level by itself. Games can be or include rule-based environments. So echoing Plas here, echoing what Salin and Zimmerman defined basically 20 years ago. There is system feedback. So you do something within the system will react in a certain way. And we're going to see one example of that pretty soon. There is a challenge, and oftentimes that challenge is progressive. You start slow, you start acclimating the player as to what this game is and what you can do in the game, really bringing into those rules and the limitations of the system, and gradually increasing the difficulty and requiring more skills from the players within the environment. In most cases, games are designed around visual and auditory aesthetics, and that is also part of the system feedback. So in some cases, you'll see characters' expressions or characters disappearing. There is sound to set the tone and to provide context in terms of voices. So there's a heavy multimedia aspect to game design as well. And finally, my favorite aspect of games, narrative. The most effective games for learning are centered on narratives that can carry the player and really merge learning content into a compelling story. That is the concept of endogenous fantasies. It's really hard to integrate a narrative that is meaningful within the game, but when you're able to accomplish that, the results can be very outstanding. So to put all of that into practice, let's look at a familiar example. Even if you haven't played it before, you know of Super Mario Brothers. Straight away, you can see the visual aesthetics here, the classic Mario pixel. You can see the challenge here. You have the enemy walking towards Mario, and the rules of the system are that you can only progress back and forth and through jumping. and jumping is the way that you defeat enemies. Those are the core mechanics that are exposed to the player at the beginning of the play experience, and that carries throughout the entire game. So there are other aspects that increase complexity, and that has been included in different versions of this game, such as different power-ups or different ways that you can modify that character to defeat enemies. But those core mechanics, they never change. And that is a best-selling game that has existed for 30 years based on those core mechanics themselves. So we talked about games and their complexity. Why would we use games for learning specifically? So games are great tools to put knowledge in practice. Games can be designed environments, those design systems that can really help you in high stakes practice. So you can, for example, design a situation that in reality would be extremely dangerous in the case of military contexts, for instance, or flight training, and use a game to simulate that action just so that you don't have to do the actual thing and be able to make mistakes and learn as you go. Along those lines, games allow for real-time decision making. So as players are faced with challenges in the game environment, they have to make decisions. Oftentimes, games will give you a time limit for that decision making, either through visuals or feedback in the game, or in the case of gamification, sometimes you might have timers on screen. And Kahoot was mentioned in the introductions. Kahoot is a classic example of decision making in gamification. You just have to make those decisions really quickly. And games are not the same today as they were when game-based learning theory started being developed in the late 1990s. The increased design complexity due to technological advancements lead to more learning affordances. So for example, nowadays we have AI, and companies are already experimenting with using AI to create characters that are more realistic, which in case of, for example, training for interpersonal interactions, it's going to be really interesting how that is applied into real use cases. There's also VR, which is a technology that has been advancing slowly but surely. VR is an outstanding platform to develop skills that um, require mastery of specific equipment and require environmental awareness. So as the technology evolves, the theory evolves along with it. Most of game-based learning started with investigations of commercial games and instruction. What you see here on the screen are two classic examples of games that have been used in instruction for research purposes. World of Warcraft, the one that you see on the left, is a massive multiplayer online RPG where you have to defeat monsters and advance levels. There's also a community aspect. You get into different parties of individuals to defeat those monsters together. And World of Warcraft has been used very widely to train individuals, rather teach individuals language skills, specifically due to the willingness to communicate aspect. If you immerse players within this context where they have an objective and they have a community surrounding them, they will be willing to communicate in a language that is not their own. The other example that we have on the screen is Civilization. It's a game that has had multiple iterations throughout the years. What you see on the screen is the latest iteration, Civilization 6. Civilization has different aspects of diplomacy, different aspects of city planning, of general expansion, geography. There are myriad of contexts where you can use civilization and instruction. And these are just some examples. In fact, back where I was at the University of Georgia, there was a professor that used civilization to teach, I believe, geopolitics, and that worked extremely well. So now we get into the topic of serious games. After that foundational literature was established and we looked at the games that had been developed for commercial purposes, games that were designed to be sold and to engage and to be played ad nauseum, people started thinking, well, what if we leverage these components of games, what games are good for, to improve instruction? And that's where the concept of serious games was coined by learning theorists. So serious games, in essence, are games developed for instructional purposes. It is the definition of a game that is created to satisfy a learning or performance need. One important characteristic of these games is that they require a delicate balance of instructional content and fun, because if you lose one of those perspectives, if you lose one of those components, the game loses its purpose. If you lose the instructional content, if you prioritize the fun in the design, then you're losing sight of the learning objective or the performance objective that you're aiming to achieve. If you lose sight of the fun, if you don't properly design those mechanisms that engage players from the get-go, then you're just increasing cognitive load and using a rather complex activity instead of that could be delivered in another format that might have been a little bit more effective. To contextualize serious games a little bit more, and those components pertain not only to serious games, but the entirety of the game landscape. We have digital games, which are games that are developed through computer and delivered through computers, consoles, cell phones, you name it. And to create them, you obviously have to establish your learning objectives and storyboard and plan the entire thing, and also think about the mechanics. What are players going to do within that game environment? What is going to be the objective within the game itself, and how does that align with what players are going to accomplish in practice? You have to think about the graphics. What is this going to look like? Is it going to be a 3D environment? Is it going to be a 2D environment? Are you going to have graphics at all? Because games can also be text-based. Those are all things that you have to think about when creating digital games. There's also the audio component. Are you going to include conversations, audio conversations for the characters that you include in those games to immerse players a little bit more, or does that not fit into your budget? And finally, is there a narrative that encompasses that digital game experience, and is that narrative needed in the first place? you don't want any superfluous and superficial components that may detract from the experience and add meaning where there really shouldn't be. There's also board games, which entail similar things. You need to create learning objectives, graphics, and a narrative. The difference here is that you create game rules that you're going to have to, that people are going to have to abide by. And sometimes, in my experience, learning how to play a board game takes time. So you're adding a learning experience on top of that learning experience. There's also the cost and the fact that you're going to have to create physical assets. So if you're developing a board game, there are certain pieces that you're going to have to create. Nowadays, technology makes this a lot easier with 3D printing, and a lot of board games use 3D printers for their prototypes, but that is still a cost that you have to consider. Also, card games. Similar to board games, analog experiences, though there are some card games that are digital as well. Learning objectives, game rules, graphics, and physical assets, the same thing. And finally, LARP, which stands for live action role playing. I don't know if you're not familiar with LARP, it is very common in fantasy settings. You have environments where people role play as fantasy characters, and you can use that for instruction, especially in one-on-one situations that can be really effective. Again, you need to develop the learning objectives, the game rules, and the narrative. And that also has an additional aspect of expertise. People really have to know the content to be able to practice it in a real context and be able to act out the situation, because otherwise that becomes a little bit of an unrealistic scenario. Going into the specific categories and some examples here. So digital games are virtual experiences that can be linear or non-linear. So for example, you can handhold a player and have them select options in the screen from different using different strategies. You can use voice, or you can use selected boxes on the screen, and players just progress through that game linearly. You can have games that where players can fully navigate the environment in a non-linear manner. For example, if you have characters, you can interact with one character first and then with the other, or vice versa, and progress through the adventure in a more customized way. The benefit of digital games is that they can contextualize content. You can add that narrative to bring in the context that you were trying to address. You can design digital games as collaborative or competitive experiences. It's really, it can be easy to add leaderboards into these experiences. Players can also play together towards a common goal. And like I said before, they facilitate the practice of high stakes skills and knowledge in a controlled, low stakes environment. Now, we talked previously about all the different types of knowledge, all the different components that are involved in the development of digital games. They can be extremely time consuming to create, and they require different media types and different skills. I've created serious games prototypes by myself, and it is not a hyperbole that I spent hundreds of hours creating experiences that were 10 to 15 minutes long. And because I was creating everything by myself, I didn't have any other resources to rely on. That became extremely time consuming, developing all of those components while trying to keep the balance of technical, serious content and fun. Now, luckily, with the advancements in technology, with the advancements of the industry as well, there are tools out there that facilitate the development of serious games. The most popular of them by far is Unity. Unity is, or at least used to be, open source tool that um, makes the process of creating games from scratch easier. It is an entirely customizable environment, even though there are some templates that you can use to create games with Unity. You can create anything from scratch if you have knowledge of coding and if you have the graphical assets available. Game Maker and Unreal Engine are other platforms that work in a similar manner. Game Maker specializes in the creation of two-dimensional games. There are lots of independent games that have been developed with Game Maker that have become super popular, and a lot of the commercial successes that we see in terms of console gaming have been created in Unreal Engine in Unity. So these are platforms that are being used by the big guys in game development, but that real people like you and I can also pick up if we have the time and the effort and the motivation to create those games. They are available to be used. There are certain payment tiers, so depending on the size of your organization, if you create a serious game using Unity, there is some percentage of the revenue, if you commercialize that in a certain way, that you'd have to pay to Unity, but those are really specifics outside of the scope here. There are some other tools, however, that are not all-inclusive tools. Unity, GameMaker, Unreal are tools that you can create anything with, basically, in terms of games. There are also other specialized tools that focus on the creation of specific types of games. And I added one here. RPG Maker MZ is the latest iteration of a series of RPG makers. And what that means is essentially this is a tool that is used to create role-playing games. It is a template that is given to you, and it has all of the mechanics built in for that specific type of game, and you'll modify it based on your specific needs, based on your specific narrative. So you have, if you're developing a role-playing game using a tool like that, you have a little bit of a head start because you don't have to develop those mechanics from scratch. For board and card games, those are collective analog experiences that can also contextualize content, can be collaborative or competitive experiences, or both. In the case of Monopoly, for instance, you can collaborate, but essentially you're competing at the end. Also allowing for practice of high stakes skills and knowledge in a controlled low stakes environment. It can be also time consuming to create, require different media types and skills, and learning rules and gameplay can also be time consuming. What you see here on the screen is a really interesting example that I encourage you to check out Friday night at the ER, developed by Breakthrough Learning. And finally, LARPing, collective role-playing experience, which can contextualize roles, interactions. It's been used, and I've seen research out there on LARPing for crisis training, for instance. These are collective experiences where you can also practice high-stakes skills, knowledge in a controlled low-stakes environment, and that is the theme of this presentation. Again, time-consuming to plan, requires high level of performance, and lack of defined constraints may lead to broken immersion. So for example, you have a specific set of rules that you have to abide by in board games and card games, and you can cheat a little bit, but that doesn't necessarily detract from this experience. While in LARPing, if you cheat, you break that immersion entirely because you lead the conversation or the interaction in a different way. In digital games, that is not possible unless you are interfering with the code, editing the code, or those cheats are embedded in the system in some way. So there are different levels of constraints that you have to consider there as well. And so finally, we get to the desired outcomes of game-based learning. It can be time-consuming to create. It can require a lot of resources, but it can be extremely effective to put that knowledge into context, to really put learners on a seat where they have to make quick decisions if that is relevant to a specific content that you're teaching. In those lines, there's also the possibility that those skills will transfer, especially in a high fidelity situation. So let's say, for instance, you're in a flight simulator and learning the procedures of flying an airplane. If you have passive instruction for that specific content, that is not going to transfer as well as a game-based learning approach, because you're not actually going through those procedures and making those decisions in real time. And for certain populations, and especially those who grew up playing video games, there's also the relatedness, the interest in playing games. Not everybody will think that games are fun and that games belong in the workplace. So that is definitely something that you need to consider in deciding upon this approach or deciding upon design characteristics. But for populations, I would say millennials and younger interest plays a role in the learning aspect of game-based learning as well. There's also the motivational aspect, and that blends into interest. A positive game experience can lead to satisfaction and more engagement, which can, as a result, lead to better transfer and attainment of learning goals. And also, attitude towards instructional strategy, the game-based learning approach itself plays into the motivation. It is not just the extrinsic motivation that games bring, but also the intrinsic motivation that the learner itself, himself or herself, brings in as well. And then we can talk about efficiency, and it can be a little bit strange to talk about efficiency in terms of one of the desired outcomes of game-based learning, because I've been saying over and over again that these things are hard to create and time-consuming, but it can lead to better time management and cost effectiveness in specific contexts. if you're training interpersonal skills, for instance, that require constant repetition, if you interact with a game, if you have a game that trains those skills, it is a lot easier than organizing those experiences to be led by a facilitator every few weeks. If you have something that is as high stakes as flying or military training, it can lead to cost effectiveness because you don't have to use all of those resources. You can simulate those resources within a virtual environment and make sure that the kinetic skills are there in a VR environment, or if it relates to the decision making, that everything is authentic in that regard as well. So as with everything in learning, as with everything in technology, definitely pros and cons that need to be considered. Now, let me check the time. And now we go into gamification. So we talked about games and game-based learning. Gamification is an extension, I will say, of that idea. And gamification is essentially the addition of game features to non-game environments. And that could be narrative, points, achievements, other reward systems. The main benefit of gamification, or the main intent of those that implement gamification, is to increase motivation and performance and quantifiable performance. So a few examples that you might be familiar with. Duolingo is a language learning app, and it includes a different set of motivational gamification features. You have streaks that are quantifiable in a certain way. If you don't interact with the platform consistently, you lose that streak. There's also system feedback. You have different tasks within the system, and it's not only the corrective feedback that the platform offers you, you also have sound effects. So you have the positive sound effects and you have negative sound effects within that platform. It is really built for engagement in language learning. There's also Peloton, which is a famous exercise company, and similar to Duolingo, you also have daily streaks. You have milestones that are designed to motivate people to continue to exercise and to do better. Every time you exercise, if you do better than the last time, you get a personal record. There's also a leaderboard where you can compare yourself to other people during a workout. So those platforms, they have the specific functions that they are designed for, but the gamification is what they use to keep you going, to keep bringing you back to this platform from a motivational standpoint, so that you can continue to increase your performance. There are 3 different types of gamification, and these are, I didn't put the reference here, but these are from Carl Kapp, who is one of the game-based learning and gamification gurus. Kapp defines structural, content, and performance gamification. Structural gamification is gamification that is added on top of a system so that you can build in those engagement features. So for example, you can have structural gamification within a learning management system. And the way you do that, sometimes you there are the famous badges for completing certain tasks within a class or within a training. Leaderboards are controversial, but some learning management systems also have that functionality, so you can compare your performance to different learners. There are also levels. So in some learning management systems, your progression can also be gamified, and you can get different points based on all of that. So these are some ways that learning management systems incorporate structural gamification. And you can see here, this is an example from Talent LMS, and it is really important to notice the how to collect points. And that is something that I will say is extremely important for structural gamification. Tell your learners why it's there and tell your learners how it works, because otherwise it becomes meaningless. If you're giving a reward at the end, that needs to be said straight away. If you are using this for data purposes, that needs to be said straight away. If that is purely for motivation, by all means, also say that, because otherwise that just becomes noise in extraneous cognitive load. Then we have structural gamification in assessment, and we go back to the Kahoot example. Kahoot is a assessment app where you can design these questions and people can jump in and answer the question at the same time. And same as the structural gamification in learning management systems, you can have a leaderboard with points that are based on correctness and quickness. So not only do you have to answer the questions correctly, you also have to learn to answer the questions fast, so you can be the leaders. So that is really the hallmark of gamification, increasing performance and efficiency. And then we have content gamification in e-learning. This is where the lines between serious games and gamification can get kind of blurry, because a lot of times when you add in narratives within an e-learning module to gamify it, you can consider that to be a game. And from my perspective, as with all things, the beauty is in the eye of the beholder. If you develop something like that, you decide what to call it. My own take is that if you are using the narrative from a superficial level to progress learners through the experience, that is content gamification. If the narrative is really intrinsically related to the content and there is a narrative outcome and that relates to the learning objective, then that is a serious game. And then we have performance gamification. So this is an interesting and evolving concept. A lot of companies are using gamification to gamify to improve performance. So with leaderboards for, you see the example here to have employers make more calls, and there's a specific time in which you have to complete those calls. The one interesting thing about this specific example is that you can see how everybody else is performing in real time, in addition to what the rewards are. So It is not just the points and the fact that you're outperforming your peers, but also if you perform well enough, you can get prizes at the end. You don't necessarily get paid more. You don't necessarily get a promotion, but you were getting those prizes. Again, going back to motivation, performance, and efficiency. And that is what this slide is about. The desired outcomes of gamification, first and foremost, that you have a positive, and it's not game, but a positive gamified experience. So if your gamification mechanisms are well designed and well explained, that can engage learners or employers to do better. It is an incentive to increase performance, both in quality and efficiency. Now, I've been talking for quite a while, and you have a basic understanding based on what I said of game-based learning and gamification, but how do you determine the when and how to use it? I divided here the, let's see. Okay. Sorry, I was just looking at the chat. And I'll
Yeah, Marcia was just sharing here in the room. That's great to see all the different levels and types of games. It's been helpful. And also here in the room, we've been talking about that.
yeah,
We remember games from 30 years ago when they were just paper-based, and they've been involved in classroom instruction for a long time, and now they just become more digital. And
right.
what are the risks with gamification? It seems like it could turn off people or demotivate people. What have you found about gamification on the
Yeah.
previous slide about that? What is your research about, doing things, especially in that performance-based one? Does that actually work? Because we're kind of, we don't want to
Yeah.
implement that intervention because it seems like besides being costly, it could turn people off, so that's what is your opinion about gamification of performance?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question because oftentimes you think that any gamification, or at least whether what people that develop gamification platforms are going to try to sell to you, is that by using this, um, you're going to have better engagement and better motivation. But what I try to say and clarify is that there also has to be a purpose. Not everybody is going to be motivated to be the best in class or to get a prize or to outperform their peers. Um, Leaderboards can be very controversial because if you don't design them in a way that makes learners comfortable in sharing their specific data, that might lead to serious implications in terms of organizational structure and interpersonal relationships. If people can see that you are being severely outperformed by a peer, do you even belong in that organization in the first place? And that is in a workplace context. In a learning context, if you're thinking about higher ed or any other training situation, having that data can help you remedy the learning and provide more guidance to those specific learners, but that's data that can also be confidential. Specifically when used in companies, um, gamification can be a, I would say, misleading indicator of performance. because the way that gamification works is you have certain actions that you perform that are meaningful for scoring purposes and some actions that are not. And a very easy way to game the system and is to just do the minimum possible to accomplish to get those points and not necessarily be the best that you can be at your job from a qualitative standpoint. So there are dark sides to it, definitely. I haven't really done a lot of research on those specific dangers of gamification, but there is a specific book that I can recommend to you by Adrian Hahn, and I wish I had this resource um, open here. So the book is called "You've Been Played: How Corporations, Governments, and Schools Use Games to Control Us All," and that is basically the gist. Using gamification to essentially manipulate people to do what you want them to do because of that motivational aspect. Gamification, the roots of gamification are very behavioral. If you're using Kahoot is mainly from a behavioral standpoint. You want to engage young people in the assessment that otherwise would be really boring to do by themselves. Yes, that is exactly the book. And even if you don't want to read the book, Adrian Hahn has a very interesting interview on NPR. That is actually how I found out about this book. And he really just goes into detail about the dangers of gamification. As with everything, there are the pros and cons. Serious games as well. If you're using them simply to increase motivation and forgetting the essential, why are you developing this in the first place, then you can really get in trouble.
Which of these questions here is ignored that leads to the gamification or game-based learning not working?
Yeah, so I will say the first one is the main one, and these are my questions these are not specifically based on any specific study, but rather the collection of studies that I've referred to in my research and my own professional experience. The learning goals actually align with a game-based learning approach. So, for example, if you're teaching specific recall of information, why would you develop a game in the first place? Does that really need a complex environment and not just a slideshow or a job aid that you can simply hand off to the learner and they can perform the task? The and The other one is specifically for adults. Can a game-based learning approach increase learner interest based on the target audience? Like I said, there are certain populations, millennials, Gen Zers, that will be a little bit more welcoming to a game-based learning approach because chances are they interacted with games from a very early age, and the familiarity will bring that sense of relatedness. But if you are trying to bring game-based learning approach or a rather complex serious game to a population that doesn't have that practice, doesn't have that habit, you're better served doing something else. Scott, we're talking and off about scenario-based learning, and that is an easier easier way to get to the meat of the content for those who are not necessarily interested in a full-fledged game. It's a straight line to practice, and without all the bells and whistles that a game-based learning experience can bring. And it's being familiar with who you have, what the people in your organization, in your learning context are, and deciding if it's even worth it in the first place. And that's also that is also true for gamification and motivation. Does adding those bells and whistles to your learning management system improve motivation and efficiency and performance, or does that really not apply to who you're teaching, who you're training? For all of those questions, you have to know who you're teaching. You have to create learning personas. You have to really dive deep into your population to ensure that the investment is really necessary, because otherwise you're just going to be throwing thousands of dollars away, not to mention the time necessary for development.
You say about increased motivation. Does that mean the content is demotiv? I mean, tell me more about. You'd use a game because they're unmotivated, but why would he be unmotivated?
Right. So games in their core, they are designed to motivate you to keep going. I talked about the progressive challenges. So you get into a game experience it, and there are those motivational features that you do well here. The challenge grows, and you are motivated to perform even better the next time. That progression, that scaffolding is that is motivation by design. So however, that is not inherent to every learner. I will say, if that progression is not designed correctly, or if your learners are really not interested in a game-based learning approach, then that is not going to motivate them. The intrinsic motivation is going to be a lot stronger than the motivational features within games. The tool and um, the learning tools or the learning objects can only go so far. Yeah, at the end of the day, it's about who you're teaching, who you're training.
Yeah, we were talking here in the room. The motivation is that, as you said, it starts off simply with small wins to encourage people to
Right.
progress and not to give up. Kind of, another learning approach to scaffolding, where you're like, oh, you learn this thing, build upon it, and that kind of thing. And I also see that, back to your learning goals, games work well when it's decision making per se, rather than recall. So
Right.
key thing was just trying to determine, going back to the thing, what are the learning goals here, and then determining what's going to work with that type of approach, rather than saying we should do some game-based learning just to show off our ability to do it without really figuring out what's the best thing. So no, thanks for this slide. This is the key summary slide of the whole
Yeah.
presentation.
Yeah, I thought about dividing the slide, and I said, well, if there is a heart to this presentation, this is it. So feel free to screenshot or I can also share the presentation, but these are,
You can send a PDF to me later.
yeah,
I'll send it out to the participants because that's what people are asking, and that's usually the presenter send us a PDF of it out.
yeah. All right. So we talked a little bit about all of those questions, and I'm going to share the questions in the entire presentation with you all. But if you determine that game-based learning or gamification are worth the effort and the investment, consider the characteristics of your target audience when deciding upon design features. And that is from the narrative. How are you going to make that narrative relatable to your learners and to the intended content, to the actual format of the game? Is that going to be a text-based game? Is that going to be a two-dimensional game? Is that going to be a VR experience? The prior experience of your learners needs to determine, because it doesn't really matter that VR is a lot more immersive than two-dimensional environments if your learners don't know how to use it. If VR is entirely aligned with the specific content, if you need that immersion, then your design has to account for the lack of experience that your population has with that specific type of technology, and provide that training beforehand. How do you even navigate such an environment? What are the keys that you have to press? Because otherwise, all you're going to be doing is increasing confusion, increasing extraneous cognitive load, and ultimately leading to an unsuccessful learning experience. Then choose a development tool and format that aligns with the nature and culture of your organization, and that is pretty much what I just said. If you do have the resources to have a full-fledged team to create a game, and there are people that are code experts in the team, I would go for a tool that is all inclusive, such as Unity or Unreal Engine. But if you're all that you're trying to do is start from a template and develop those role-playing scenarios or other types of interpersonal communication, then you can go to some of those template tools. And finally, prototype test, and that is a cycle that is never going to end, because after every prototype session, after every implementation, there are going to be new things that you're going to have to change in your game based on navigation. Things are going to break. There are so many design components involved in a game, specifically, and even gamification for that matter, that people are going to find ways to break it, and in intended or unintended ways. So it is an inherently iterative process, and that has to be the mindset in the development of such approaches. Just some simple scenarios here for suggested development practices, because I feel like all of that I've been talking about so far has been hard to see in action. So just bringing in my personal experience and a few other examples. So for instance, if you're training learners on individual one-on-one communication, um, they don't necessarily need to navigate an entire environment. You can create a simple narrative game with predefined interaction choices, and the outcomes in that game will be shown based on players' choices and overall performance. These games can also include meters or other visual cues for performance. So for example, you can have characters, expressions, you can have meters that show satisfaction in the case of customer service training, things like that. It doesn't have to be an entire 3D experience. A simple narrative, multiple choice may be enough in that purpose for those purposes. Now, if you're looking into designing a serious game environment for problem solving that also involves interaction with multiple individuals or interface components or environment objects, you can create, for example, a resource management narrative game. The example here on the screen is Do I Have a Right by iCivics. And in this game, you have navigational freedom. You can go around the room and interact with different characters. And same as before, the outcomes shown are based on players' actions, overall performance, and also the progression. What did you interact with? What did you not interact with? Did the progression of the decision-making steps mirror what needs to be done in a real situation? And like previously, can include meters or other visual cues for performance. So in this example, we have prestige, we have the number of trials here, and other interface components for that guide the player in their decision making. And then we have content focused on high stakes practices and procedures. And in those cases, it is highly recommended to create high fidelity simulated environments with navigational freedom, again, environment and or interface if needed, with outcomes that are shown based on players' actions, progression, and overall performance. And the visual cues for performance, in this case, given the high fidelity nature of the game, should be based on real world indicators. So for instance, we have the example here from full code medical, and basically you're treating this patient, and the visual indicators are going to be somewhat a representation of what would happen in real life if you, for example, don't diagnose the correct problem, the patient, that might lead to serious consequences for the patient. If there's a surgery that needs to be performed and you start the procedure in a wrong manner, that is also reflected poorly on the game. So that fidelity is important to show you the real consequences of making this decision in a real setting. That will increase the transfer and allow you to make those mistakes as you practice. When implementing the game, and I've said this time and time again, ensure that learners are taught how to interact with the game and the gaming platform. I talked about gamification, but that also rings true for serious games, especially if your learners are not entirely familiar with a game-based learning form environment. It bringing to the basics from navigation. Not everybody is going to know how to navigate an environment. Can you go up, down, left, and right, or can you go all directions? Can you look up? Can you look down? These are all things that you have to tell your learners through a tutorial. How do you interact with objects in the environment? How do you make choices in a game? And that can be part of the progression in a game-based learning experience, and that can be part of the acclimation in gamification as well. Iteration ensuring that technical and content issues are addressed in a timely manner. Going back to your prototype, test, and improving your design with data. So it's, like I said in the beginning of the presentation, this is really an underrated aspect of game-based learning. You can have so much data from game-based learning interactions and gamification if you do it correctly. One way to obtain analytics data from your players is using learning standards such as XAPI, where you can obtain all of the decisions that they've made when interacting with a game-based environment. Gamification platforms can also provide a lot of insight in terms of engagement and how long did learners spend with specific content, and even the visual markers and the points themselves, that is data that you can go by. Even if you don't have all of those bells and whistles that you can directly embed into your learning experiences, either your serious games or your gamified platforms, you can use surveys with users. How did it go? What did you have problems with when navigating this environment or while interacting with the platform? What can we do to do better? For example, in one of the serious games that I created, one of the survey results was that it was taking too long to get to the actual content, and that brought to my attention a lack of alignment between not a lack of alignment, but a lack of efficiency in getting to the actual content. I was prioritizing the narrative in detriment of introducing learners to the content that I was trying to convey through that serious game. And that's how you learn. You're only one person or a team, and only by testing what you're creating, you're going to get something that is effective and that can lead to long-term effectiveness and results, which is what we're looking for. And like I said, I've been talking for a very long time, so thank you very much.
Yes, you have a question?
Yeah,
Mhm.
can you hear me?
Yes.
So in doing the gamification, have you found that the return on investment or the cost benefit analysis sometimes isn't worth the bang for the buck?
That is, yeah, that can be the case. I don't have a lot of, and I have more experience with serious games than gamification per se. But I will say that the inherent capabilities of the platform need to be considered. So for example, if you have a learning management system that includes those gamification features from the get-go, and that is not something that you have to invest upon, by all means try it. I will say adding in gamification to existing platforms for the sake of improving motivation can be a gamble, because you never know how it's going to go. So to answer your question in a roundabout way, it sometimes is not worth the investment, and you just have to try it to see. And my recommendation is, if you're trying to implement this at a large scale, maybe test it with a focus group first, see how that goes for a small scale setting, a representative population for your organization, because that can really demotivate people. All the negative things that I said that can happen, from the gaming the system to the dangers to rupturing interpersonal communication. So everything needs to be thought out.
Actually, I have a question.
Go ahead.
Oh, come up, Bill.
I have a question that I'm not real familiar with it, but Second Life, I guess, is where you have independent avatars.
Mhm.
Would that be a gamification, or just any experience with something like Second Life where you have independent avatars? Is that like a multiplayer game thing, or? Leave it
That's
over.
interesting. Yeah. So that's another one of those, depends on who you ask. I would qualify as more of a social platform, um, for virtual interaction. In the beginning, it was called a game because we didn't really have much of those platforms. But since it doesn't have a quantifiable outcome or specific challenges that you have to face, I will say it lacks some of the basic characteristics that we'd consider for us to consider it a game. I would say it's more of a social simulator than a specific game.
Okay, so for a learning outcome, an organization might use it to test interpersonal skills or something like that, and wouldn't it still be used for a learning outcome? But not necessarily a game or
It
gamification.
could be an assessment. It could be and use it as assessment, is what you're saying?
I'm just asking, it's kind of,
Yeah.
I've never used it, just wondering.
Yeah, and Second Life has actually been investigated in research also, language learning. I keep going back to language learning because that's my background, but just the way that the platform enables you to interact with other people and bringing in those simulated conversations. Second Life and similar platforms um, can definitely be used for that specific practice. One of the benefits is that you can put yourself in the shoes of specific characters. So the character doesn't necessarily need to look like you or behave like you. It facilitates that role-playing aspect, and even creating a digital LARP of sorts, where you practice those conversations that can then be replicated in real practice. So yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
So what resources or what applications do you recommend for someone who's interested in doing it, but does not have that large influx of revenue to do so?
That is a very good question. So my first recommendation would be to look at specific specialized vendors and see what they can offer out of the box. And I can and there are several companies out there that can create tailored game-based learning based on your own specific needs. And I will mention Filament Games as one of them that I followed consistently. They partnership with iCivics. So if you don't have the resources to build in-house, then those external vendors would be your best bet. If you for other types of for serious games, you would need a specific team, dedicated team to develop that specific game tailored to that specific need that your organization experiences on a regular basis, because otherwise I don't see the need to develop a game for a one-time performance. For gamification, you might look into learning management systems with built-in gamification features, and Talent LMS, the example that I used, is only one of them. It has those embedded badges and leaderboards for motivation, and that can be a way of testing the waters. If you do decide for serious games, you can start slow, creating prototypes, using it with a focus group. And I tell my students, if you create a paper prototype that communicates how a game is played, that is as effective as a full-fledged as effective as a full-fledged game from at least a functional standpoint, and that's your proof of concept to pursue more investment. So different ways of looking at this issue and making decisions there, because yeah, it can be an investment that we can get enamored with the bells and whistles, but at the end of the day, is it solving the problem is what we need to consider.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Mhm.
Thank you, I really thought this was a very interesting, clarifying session between games and gaming. It really made me realize that we talked among ourselves that we've been doing this for years, we just haven't named it. And
Right.
I named it.
Yeah, and it's one of those things when I see gamification blended in with game-based learning, I'm not one of those people that will start a conversation and an argument with you about it, because as long as the core elements of what you're talking about are there, what matters is what you're doing, how you're designing, and how you're delivering. I just want to focus on the results of what you're creating instead of what you're calling it, because sometimes what you're calling it can also change from culture to culture. There's a whole genre of games called visual novels that are games by definition, but what they are interactive novels, basically. So they are narratives with minimal decision making. Is that a game? Some cultures, like the Japanese culture who developed it, say yes. In some circles, not so much. So.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Well, thanks again, Raphael, for your expertise and sharing your knowledge and experience. This has been great on this. We're still looking for, any of your students or anybody that has a case study on using AI in instructional design. We're still looking for that. That's one of our topics we're still looking for. So if you see one that's good, let me know. Or in the future, in the fall, if you've got some ideas on that one, that'd be another great presentation, because that's a interesting, neat topic. And so again, thank you for your time.
No, yeah, no, thank you.
On the last slide, I'll send the email address out tomorrow with the deck and a link to the recording.
Okay.
So you want to stop the recording, Mark? Or
Sounds good. And I can go ahead and send you the slideshow as soon as we get off the call. So
yeah, I'll get to it tomorrow morning. So hey, thanks again.